All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this video of Introduction to American Politics. And today we are going to talk about social policy. So it seems like these days social policies are what cause the most divisive political discourse in the country. It seems to elicit all sorts of emotions, all sorts of name calling, bad faith arguments. It really ramps up the rhetoric. But why? And ultimately, it comes down to the fact that, in principle, we all want the same outcome, but where we really differ is how to get there. And also, we all have different visions as to what the actualization of those goals actually mean. So, for example, everybody wants access to healthcare, and everybody thinks healthcare should be accessible to all, but how healthcare is accessible, well, a lot of people believe different things in that regard. The other thing about that is if you say, for example, a generic term like healthcare reform, people tend to be on board with that because, according to polls, most people do view the status quo to be in need of change. However, they don't like specific programs. There are certain, whenever they start discussing specific policy prescriptions, they don't agree. Another example is firearms. People are divided as to the availability for firearms, whether they should be limited or restricted, and even then, even people that do agree to some level of restrictions, there's disagreement as to what those restrictions should look like. And then finally, people want some sort of tax reform. You know, polls show that a lot of people think that people should be paying more in taxes, but they don't want to lose their own tax deductions. So they want people in general to pay more taxes, but they individually don't want to pay more taxes. And this is a policy dilemma that is quite prevalent with regard to social policy, and one that policymakers have to deal with time and time again. The thing about social policies is that they're largely redistributive. They largely entail allocating funds or allocating resources from one segment of the population to another. Principal domains tend to be things like the social safety net with regard to poverty, healthcare, order and safety, housing, education, and transportation. Now, the thing about social spending is that we often, though we disagree about what we should be spending on, we tend to spend it anyway. There are mass deficits nationally in the country right now. We had a bit of a surplus in the late 90s under the Clinton administration, but by and large, the name of the game has been budget deficits. We spend way more than we take out. Like I said, a big cause of the discourse is that though there's disagreement over social policy, economic policy, um, people tend to get their lower taxes, right? But we also tend to get more and more spending on status quo social welfare programming. And so the result are these massive and growing deficits. So let's talk about how we got there. Well, a big driver of the discourse and a big driver of the disagreement is with regard to how to handle poverty in this country and whether or not it should be through some sort of social safety net. The social policies directed towards the poor are often what is called means tested. This isn't something that's simply offered to anybody who wants to partake. Individuals have to prove their eligibility to partake in these programs, especially welfare. So one such example is the 10th or the TANF program, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. This is cash assistance from the state using federal monies to redistribute it to families who are below a certain income level. Another program is SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. This is more or less food stamps, state aid for the purposes of purchasing food. And these programs drive a lot of the discourse with regard to social safety nets. These programs are often discussed as though they are driving a lot of the budget deficits. However, they're really not. We do spend a lot of money, yes, and there are certainly people that try to argue that families will tend to get used to this kind of assistance and disincentivize families to look for work. However, look at the average monthly benefit to a single parent caring for 2 children by state. So through this program in the state of Texas, an individual who's caring for 2 children can expect, under temporary assistance for needy families, $263 a month in the state of Texas. In Mississippi, $170 a month. In Arizona, $277 a month. Now, in California, $638, New York, $770, but you have to account for the difference in cost of cost of living. And so the families that are on these programs largely cannot rely on them as their sole source of resources or their sole source of income. The daily benefit per person, as you can see here, is a few dollars per day, more or less, anywhere between 2 and 5, for the most part, for most of the United States, with some in excess of $5 per individual per day in the blue states here, primarily in the Northeast and West Coast. So the families that are on these programs don't actually get a lot in terms of cash on hand. The SNAP program, again, not much better in terms of financial assistance. As you can see here, I have the average monthly food stamp benefit per participant. Texas, a little over $100 per month per person. And remember, this has to be restricted to food. So in the state of Texas, the average food stamp participant is only allowed to spend $115 per month on food. Other types of social safety net programs are not just cash assistance, in which government agencies send money directly to beneficiaries, but also through social insurance programs, such as Social Security or unemployment. Now, we all pay, for those of you that are employed, we all pay Social Security taxes that come out of our paychecks. Social Security is one of the most popular programs in the country. However, it's also one of the programs that has the biggest long-term funding shortfalls. As you can see here, Social Security spending and Medicare spending and Medicaid spending has skyrocketed over recent decades. And it's running at a growing and permanent deficit. The deficit is only growing, and it doesn't look like it's going to run a surplus within our lifetimes, as it turns out. And why is that? Well, it's largely because of our aging population, coupled with lowering birth rates. In 1960, there were 5.1 workers to every 1 beneficiary of Social Security. And remember, Social Security is funded through the workforce, through payroll taxes. So it relies on a large number of contributors and a smaller number of beneficiaries. So in the 1960s, there were about 5 people who were contributing for every one beneficiary. By 2009, that had been reduced to 3 contributors to every one beneficiary. And by 2030, it's expected to be closer to 2 contributors for every one beneficiary. And so the long-term sustainability of the Social Security program is very much in question. And so unless there is some sort of policy intervention or replacement, the long-term sustainability of the program is very much in doubt. Let's move on to health policies. Now, health is an interesting issue because it did not actually make it into the public discourse until around the 1960s. Health wasn't really considered something that the government got involved in, wasn't really considered the government's role. However, the Great Society programs of the 1960s, the massive expansion of social services under the Johnson administration, talked about healthcare more. And this is where we get what eventually became Medicare and Medicaid out of these programs. One agency that has been in the news a lot lately, the National Institute of Health, was created. It funds research on health issues. There's also preventative agencies, the Food and Drug Administration, which licenses and regulates sale of food and drugs. They set up regulations for what types of products can enter the market as food or medicine. Again, I mentioned the Medicare and Medicaid programs. Medicare is government subsidized healthcare for elderly citizens once someone reaches over the age of 65. It is the most expensive federal program as of right now, and expenses are only growing. Medicaid is healthcare for the poor, both adults and children. And costs for these are shared between both the state and the federal government. So the largest drivers here of social welfare spending is actually the Social Security and healthcare programs, Medicare and Medicaid. The welfare programs, which are sometimes turned into the boogeymen of political discourse with regard to social welfare programs, actually don't cost the government a whole lot, but rather the Social Security and healthcare programs. Finally, well, not finally, but another area is public order and safety. To deal with crime, state and local governments, administer police forces that handle most crime prevention. Again, another thing that's been in the news this year. The federal government role for bank robbery, tax evasion, and drug trafficking is much more robust. These types of crimes are considered bigger federal offenses, and so the federal government has a bigger role in those types of issues. And the Department of Homeland Security, it was created in response to the 9/11 attacks. And so the federal government, in collaboration with state services, also deals with issues such as terrorism. But this large government role, as I said, this has been in the news lately, is one that is being questioned here recently. Not only because of the issue of police brutality and disparities in the justice system with regard to race, but also because of our massive incarceration rates. We have the largest number of prisoners per person in the world, or one of the largest number of persons in prison per 100,000 people per capita. We are second, as a matter of fact. There are 698 people for every 100,000 citizens in this country that are currently incarcerated. So we have amongst the highest incarceration rates in the world. compared to most countries, compared to China, compared to Russia. Again, we're only second. Safety is another big issue. And this comes not only in the form of crime prevention, but also environmental safety. The Environmental Protection Agency is charged with carrying out environmental laws and enforcing regulations. This affects not only public health, but food and water quality. And it also works to prevent the dilemma of polluting common areas and common spaces. So it prevents private entities, companies, corporations from dumping chemicals into public waters, demolishing public lands, and things like that. Housing. This is another area of federal social welfare and state social welfare interventions. So they often do things like encourage home ownership through housing loans, mortgage interest tax deductions. So you have various not only loans but also tax incentives in order to buy a home and maintain a home. And of course, the federal government also contracts and builds cheaper government subsidized housing, known as sexual, and also provides subsidies for rental assistance. Education policy is something that has only in recent years really seen an expansion of the federal role. Now, don't get me wrong, education is still the purview of the state government. But over the past 10 years, the federal government has expanded its role with regard to education policy. Now, it's mostly funded at the state and local level, but the national government has pumped a lot more money and put a lot more conditions on that money. There was the No Child Left Behind Act, which tied federal funds to testing performance, something that was met with great controversy because of its reliance on standardized tests. However, this legislation was replaced in 2015. Its replacement still relies on standardized tests in grades 3 through 8 and in high school, but it offloads onto the state's intervention for underperforming schools. So rather than putting that responsibility of funding underperforming schools on the federal government, puts that responsibility more so on the states. However, this was something that education reformists were happy about. It uses multiple indicators to determine performance rather than just a singular standardized test, which was the metric used under No Child Left Behind. And some of you who are listening to this video might be familiar with the fact that beyond K through 12 education, the federal government also provides grants and loans for the purposes of higher education. Some of you might be on Pell Grants right now. Some of you might be on other types of financial assistance through the government. And so this is another way that the government intervenes with regard to education policy. So in this discussion of all the major policy domains where we see social policy intervention by the government, there are trade-offs in all of these, between these ideals of liberty and equality. If we really put emphasis on liberty, there would be no government assistance, there would be no government intervention. Everybody would be free to make their own way about things. But one of the principles that we also have in this country is these notions of equality, that we also need to give everybody a fair shot. So this is where government intervention comes in. And in a sense, it's evening the playing field. But the debate and the discourse comes from the fact that, we all agree we want people to succeed, but we disagree on the best way to go about doing that. So like I said, both parties favor access to health care. I noted that at the beginning of this video. Democrats would be more likely to support government-funded health insurance. However, Republicans support private insurance marketplaces. Both have this idea that these mechanisms will increase access to healthcare, but they have very different ideas on what will get us to achieve that goal. But, you know, they're not always on the same page with regards to goals in that way. So, for example, the parties are split with regard to abortion and health services. The Democrats, in their party platform, are in favor of not only maintaining the legalization of abortion, but also providing health care with regard to abortion services. The Republicans would, in their platform, ban the practice entirely. And so, on occasion, and this is one example, the courts have actually stepped in to determine uh, which way to go whenever the parties have been at an impasse with regard to what can and cannot happen with policy intervention. Abortion is only one of them, but it's one example. And so, in all of these social policy domains, what I want you to think about is overall, what is the purpose here? If we have these notions of liberty in this country and um, the ability to pursue whatever goals you want, then social intervention should not be necessary or as minimal as possible. Everybody would have to make their own way. But the interventions are essentially a recognition that not everybody starts off in the same place. Not every person is playing on an even playing field. And so that's where these interventions that attempt to equalize the playing field come in. So that's it for this lecture. If you have any questions, feel free to email me.